This is Humans, true stories about the most intriguing parts of human behaviour, the good, the bad, and the downright horrific. Late one evening in 2014, within a number of villages in the Neho-Rawa constituency, a number of boys and men were amping themselves up and getting themselves ready for the busy night ahead. They were pasting on the last of their face paint like wall makeup, and they were preparing to set off on the 10-kilometre journey. It was a walk along the public roads leading to Sakiko village. Sakiko village was a place where people suspected of sorcery and witchcraft had gone and sought refuge. The 120 men and 69 juveniles marched their way to Sakiko village with the sole purpose of finding suspected witches and killing them. The group of men and boys knew each other through friendships, through family, some through blood, others didn't know each other at all and were just sort of there for the ride. The violence happened quickly. Before the mob had even reached the village, a few members noticed a lone man walking along one of the roads. This man was called CK, and he was on his way to do a shift at the local sugar factory. He saw the mob approaching and he did attempt to run, but within seconds he was shot with a bow from a bow and arrow and fell down. Before he had chance to find his feet again, he was attacked by men from all angles with bush knives and axes, and he died pretty much instantly. The mob then proceeded to the village and began raiding it. They soon came across another man attempting to escape the village. His name was Nick. One member of the group shot him through the eye with a bow and arrow, and as he fell down, the rest of the group mobbed on top of him and proceeded to, quote, chop him up. His death resulted from an open skull fracture and multiple body mutilation. The mob continued to raid houses and gardens of people who lived there, and other people in the mob threatened and chased away anyone who was still around. The third person to come face to face with one of the leaders was called Yambung. He was first speared in the knee, and then he was sliced in the face with a bush knife. He suffered multiple limb severing, and he also died from an open skull fracture and multiple body mutilation. Next, a man called Burmo was attempting to fight off members of the mob as he was trying to protect his granddaughter. But he was against 5 people, all with weapons, and he didn't have any weapons. His skull was cut open and he suffered multiple limb mutilation. At this point, an elderly man came out of his house to see what was going on. He'd been asleep when he'd heard all of the commotion outside, and as he came out, he was immediately slashed in the face and fell to the floor. He was then thrown back inside his house, and the house was set on fire. He died of incineration. A mother was running away from the commotion, trying to escape, and she had 3 of her children with her. She was carrying the younger one, and the 2 others were by her side. And then the 3-year-old child, Nathan, was pulled away from his mother and was slashed with a bush knife, and he died immediately from an open skull fracture. Finally, a 5-year-old boy who was with his family, and they were all trying to escape the commotion, he was taken by a group of fully grown men, and he was axed to death. He died from multiple skull fractures. After the mob had finished killing people and destroying this peaceful village, they left. The violence was described as, quote, people being killed by having been slashed from their legs upwards and their heads were cut off and taken away. These men and boys left, truly believing that there would be no consequences for their actions, and in fact, believing that they'd done the right thing. The village of Sakiko was left broken and destroyed and utterly devastated by what had happened. Over the next few weeks and months, the villagers of Sakiko laid their loved ones to rest and began mourning their losses. They were not only having to deal with the fact that they had lost their loved ones to these violent acts, but they were also terrified of when the mob might come back and return to finish what they'd started. But on the 22nd of March 2017, an act of history was made. 97 people were named as the mob members who had attacked Sakiko village on that fateful night. The judge said that the 97 people were arraigned on 7 counts of willful murder. They each pleaded not guilty, and on April 22nd, 2017, a joint trial for all 97 men was held. The maximum penalty for willful murder in Papua New Guinea is death. Even though 97 people were named and arrested for these crimes, 9 of those men actually managed to escape from prison. The majority of the offenders were between 18 and 35 years of age, and most were found to have limited education or understanding of the gravitas of what they had done. Either way, all 97 were found guilty. The state's position was that the 8 offenders who had actually committed those murders themselves by their hands should have the maximum sentence, so they would be sentenced to death. Each of the 88 remaining offenders all stood at trial and made an individual statement themselves. Each apologised for what they had done. They apologised to the community, they apologised to the families of those that they'd affected, and they apologised to God. Each expressed remorse. Some said that it wasn't their intention to go out there and kill someone that night, they were just following the group. Most sought mercy from the court and said that they would like a non-custodial sentence. Many expressed their personal circumstances and said that they had family to care for, and if they went away to prison or if they were sentenced to death, then their families would not be able to survive and they would likely die as well. At trial, it was submitted on behalf of the offenders that despite the horrific nature of those killings, the court must consider the special circumstances in which the offences were committed. Quote, "The events took place because of a genuine belief in sorcery. These were not payback killings. The offenders formed a group called the Housemen, as it was the consensus amongst a number of villages that drastic action had to be taken to weed out the scourge of sorcery. Too many innocent lives have been lost, so they did what they did." There was no evidence that the 7 people who were killed were actually accused of sorcery. The only, quote, sins of the victims was their inability to escape that night through their vulnerabilities, which might have been age, or it might have been the fact that they were just outnumbered by 10, 20, 30 mob members. The state then suggested that the 8 members who had been found directly responsible for the deaths of those people should be sentenced to death. It was found that there was no evidence that the victims were chosen because there was a belief that they had committed some sort of sorcery or witchcraft. Quote, "How could the belief in sorcery justify or mitigate the heinous murder of CK, an innocent man on his way to work? How could it mitigate or explain the senseless, horrible killings of 3-year-old Nathan or 5-year-old Anau, who were taken from their mother's arms and killed instantly? Even in the case of the 3 elderly men, there was no evidence that any of them was targeted because he was a suspected sorcerer. There was no proven connection between the belief in sorcery and what actually happened. So the genuine belief in sorcery is not a mitigating factor. It cannot be regarded as an extenuating circumstance to lessen the gravity of the crimes." 89 of the offenders received life sentences and 8 of the offenders received the death penalty. This case is believed to be the first conviction of sorcery-related violence in Papua New Guinea. That's kind of where the case ends, unfortunately. As you can tell, there's not a huge amount of specific detail about what went on or about the victims' lives. And unfortunately, although this case ends there, that's not where the story ends. In 2013, there was a case where 3 women were killed. The first was the murder of a woman called Kapari, who was a 20-year-old mother who was accused by family members of a 6-year-old boy who had just a couple of weeks before died in hospital of an illness. Kapari was stripped and bound and tortured before being hit with an iron rod and then doused in gasoline, thrown onto a pile of car tyres and rubbish and set alight. Hundreds of people, including children, stood by and watched this happen. There were hundreds of photos taken, and those photos were later published on the nation's most popular newspaper. Investigators failed to make any arrests, despite there being literally hundreds of witnesses. It was reported that the public were not cooperating with the police, and actually Kapari's husband was the main suspect, and he had fled straight after the murder. It was also revealed that officers believed that, quote, more than 50 people had laid a hand on the victim. This is alongside many witnesses, including lots of children. The other highly publicised case was the murder of a 40-year-old woman called Helen, and she, her two nieces who were teenagers, and her sister were all taken forcibly from Helen's home by people with machetes and guns and knives. The villagers burned down their house and took the women away after they'd been accused of killing another villager with black magic. The 4 women were taken and they were tortured. They were slashed with knives. But fortunately, there were negotiations with the police and Helen's sister and 2 nieces were released. However, Helen was not released, and just a little while later, she was publicly beheaded. The mob said that they had proof that Helen was a witch because the grave of someone who had died recently had marks on it that indicated that black magic had been used. And also a swarm of fireflies had led them directly to Helen's house, which is apparently an indication that sorcery has been used. These 2 horrific killings were brought into the West through social media, actually, and the international community turned its view towards Papua New Guinea. The stories being told and the murders being committed were placing blame and criminalisation on Papua New Guinea's culture. The government was urged to take immediate action. One part of the problem is that anyone in the community can level this kind of an accusation, and they obviously don't need any sort of evidence. And this is made worse by the fact that these sorcery accusations are usually used to target people who are already ostracised from those communities. Evidence shows that poorer people are much more likely to be targeted than wealthier people. In the case of Helen that I just spoke about, it suggested that her case was because of jealousy, because of her family's position in the village. Her house stood out because it was made of wood and it was more permanent than some of the others in the village. Helen's husband and son had government positions, and generally her family was well educated and had a sort of high social standing. And more recently, in 2017, Time reported that one of the youngest ever victims of sorcery violence that had been discovered at this point was a 7-year-old girl, and her name in the source material that I read was disguised, so we're just going to give her a fake name. We're going to call her Ruby. And the people of Ruby's village decided that she must be a witch or have some kind of magical powers that she had used to strike down another young child. The angry group decided that they must kill her, but they said that first they would torture her to get more information from her, and then they'd murder her. 4 years prior to Ruby being accused of witchery, her mother was actually accused of being a witch. A local child had died, and there was no logical explanation that they could find as to why this had happened. For some unknown reason, Ruby's mother was the focus of the witch hunt, and the villagers said that she was the one who had killed this child. She was abducted, stripped naked, attacked with machetes, and eventually thrown on a pile of tyres and burned alive. Hundreds of people watched. Hundreds of people saw this happening and did nothing. And so after Ruby's mother was killed, she was taken 100 miles away to go and live with other family members. But even all that distance away, it turned out that Ruby was in real danger. One of Ruby's cousins became really unwell, and her family members decided that she must have taken this unwell child's heart and devoured it. The family sent 2 of Ruby's other family members to collect Ruby and take her to this nearby wooded area. A group of angry men and women gathered round Ruby and tied her up. They suspended her from ropes tied to her wrists and ankles, and they also flayed her with matches. Time reported that Ruby said, quote, "They got a big knife and put it in the fire, and then they hurt my feet." Ruby remembers her family member who was ill, the whole reason that this was happening to her, she would become slightly better as Ruby was being tortured. But when the torture momentarily stopped, she would start groaning and crying, and her condition would apparently be worsening. Ruby was continuously tortured until 5 a.m. the following morning. She was then restrained for the next 5 days. Her captors wanted to keep a hold of her to see if Nancy would in fact improve. Ruby suspected the family member, the child who was ill, of faking it. She said that she was jealous of the attention that Ruby was getting. Thankfully, during this time, word of Ruby's kidnap and torture had gotten back to Papua New Guinea Tribal Foundation, and the employees there worked on securing Ruby's freedom. They managed to get Ruby released to them into their care by saying that if they didn't release Ruby immediately, they would send the police and the army in. Ruby was then taken into a car and driven through the night to ensure no one was following them, and they eventually arrived safely at a nearby airstrip, and they caught a flight to Port Moresby. Over the next few days and weeks, Ruby was actually unable to sit down because of her injuries. She suffered a knife wound that went through her left leg at the knee, almost all the way through. She also had first-degree burns over a large portion of her body. Time reported that Papua New Guinea's health system was not of much help, so Ruby and her rescuers were forced to treat Ruby's injuries with whatever they had lying around. So mainly that was honey and oil. It was literally just anything they had to hand. Ruby was terrified after the torture that she'd endured, and she found it very, very difficult to trust and to let anyone into her life. But thankfully, she was actually adopted. She was adopted by the people that rescued her, and she is slowly beginning to trust again. Ruby has since learnt to read and write in English and is attending school. She's also being considered for therapy to help her deal with everything that had happened to her, as well as beginning to understand what happened to her mother. To this day, in 2022, no one has been held accountable for the torture that happened to Ruby, even though she can identify everyone who was involved. And neither has anyone been arrested or held accountable for Ruby's mother's murder. There have been around $3 million of government funds allocated for an intensive awareness program around sorcery, but according to a number of sources that I read, not much has changed. They say that activists are insisting that unless foreign assistance is tied to tackling gender-based violence and improving access to healthcare, nothing will change. Tribal Foundation, who helped to rescue Ruby, and they are really only able to deal with the actual violence that is happening. They're not able to challenge the actual beliefs of sorcery, violence, or witchcraft or black magic. They say, quote, "Try telling the illiterate mother of a child who died of sudden infant death syndrome that the true cause of death was an unfathomable medical phenomenon, rather than, as her village elders say, the nefarious spirit of a crow she saw lurking the previous evening. When we disprove of beliefs, we experience a lot of confrontation and pushback." Tribal Foundation do real work to help educate villagers, especially regarding diseases and illnesses that they otherwise would not know about. Preserving the essence of cultures and traditions of certain Papua New Guinea communities is really important to Tribal Foundation in some respects, but not at the cost of life or harm to anyone, especially those deemed most vulnerable. This is Humans, true stories about the most intriguing parts of human behaviour, the good, the bad, and the downright horrific.